What is Buddhism? The name Buddhism comes from the word buddhi, which means to wake up, and thus Buddhism is the philosophy of awakening. This philosophy has its origins in the experience of the man Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha, who was himself awakened at the age of 35. Buddhism is now 2,500 years old and has about 300 million followers worldwide. Until 100 years ago, Buddhism was mainly an Asian philosophy, but increasingly it is gaining adherents in Europe, Australia and America.
So Buddhism is just a philosophy?
The word philosophy comes from two words, philo, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom or love and wisdom. Both meanings describe Buddhism perfectly. Buddhism teaches that we should try to develop our intellectual capacity to the fullest so that we can understand clearly. It also teaches us to develop love and kindness so that we can be like a true friend to all beings. So Buddhism is a philosophy, but not just a philosophy. It is the supreme philosophy.
Who was the Buddha?
In the year 563 BC, a baby was born into a royal family in northern India. He grew up in wealth and luxury, but eventually found that worldly comforts and security do not guarantee happiness. He was deeply moved by the suffering he saw all around and resolved to find the key to human happiness. When he was 29, he left his wife and child and set off to sit at the feet of the great religious teachers of the day to learn from them. They taught him much, but none really knew the cause of human suffering and how it could be overcome. Eventually, after 6 years' study and meditation, he had an experience in which all ignorance fell away and he suddenly understood.
But how can someone who lived over 2,500 years ago still be relevant to our lives today?
Well, think of it like this. The Buddha wasn't claiming to be a god or a prophet,
Right.
revealing divine truths.
Oh.
He was simply a human being who, through his own efforts, discovered a path to overcome suffering and achieve lasting happiness. And that path, the teachings he shared, are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
It's like he created a roadmap for inner peace that anyone can follow.
Exactly. His teachings are timeless because they address the fundamental human experience, the desire for happiness and the struggle with suffering.
Right.
And those experiences are universal regardless of what century you live in.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if he wasn't a god, why do people seem to worship him?
Oh, it's a common misconception.
Yeah, I've seen the statues, the incense, the bowing.
Right.
It all seems pretty religious to me.
It's important to understand that Buddhists don't worship the Buddha as a deity. They revere him as a teacher, a guide, and an example of what's possible for any human being.
I see. So what's with all the rituals and symbolism?
Sure.
What do those represent?
Well, the rituals and symbols in Buddhism are not about worshiping a supernatural being.
Yeah.
They're tools to help us cultivate mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom.
Got it.
For example, the Buddha statue, with its serene expression,
Yeah.
it's a reminder to cultivate those qualities within ourselves. The incense represents the pervasiveness of virtue, the lamps symbolize wisdom, and the flowers represent the impermanent nature of all things.
Okay, that clarifies things.
Yeah.
But what about the act of bowing? What's the significance of that?
Bowing is a gesture of respect and gratitude. It's not about submitting to a higher power, but about acknowledging the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha and expressing gratitude for his teachings.
It's like saying thank you for the guidance.
Exactly. And it's also a way of cultivating humility and letting go of our ego.
I can see how that would be helpful in our often ego-driven world. But speaking of misconceptions, what about this whole idol worship thing I've heard people say about Buddhism?
Oh, that's another common misunderstanding.
Right.
The term idol refers to an image worshipped as a god. And Buddhists don't believe the statues themselves are gods. They're simply representations of the Buddha's qualities and teachings, serving as focal points for meditation and reflection.
So it's more about connecting with the inner meaning rather than worshiping an external object.
Precisely. It's similar to the way other religions use symbols,
Right.
like the Christian cross, the Jewish Star of David, the Islamic crescent moon.
Yeah.
These are representations of ideas, not objects of worship themselves.
That's a helpful way to think about it. But I have to admit, I've seen some things in Buddhist temples that I just don't understand.
Yeah.
Sometimes it gets a little strange.
Understandable.
Like, how do you know what's authentic and what's just cultural baggage?
The key is to always go back to the source, the Buddhist teachings.
Yeah.
Don't judge Buddhism by practices that might have evolved over time or been influenced by local customs.
Right.
Judge it by the core principles and the wisdom that the Buddha shared.
It's like judging a recipe by someone who doesn't know how to cook.
Exactly. And the Buddha himself warned against blindly following traditions or rituals. He encouraged his followers to question, investigate,
Yeah.
and rely on their own understanding.
That's a refreshing approach.
Yeah.
It's not about dogma.
Right.
It's about personal exploration and understanding. Speaking of exploring, do Buddhists have a big holiday?
They do.
Like something like Christmas?
It's called Visakha, and it falls on the full moon day in April or May,
Okay.
and it marks the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and passing.
Wait, all three events on the same day?
All on the same day.
That seems like a pretty big coincidence.
It might seem that way, but it highlights a crucial aspect of the Buddhist worldview.
Okay.
The interconnectedness of life, death, and enlightenment. They're not seen as separate events, but as part of a continuous cycle.
So Visakha is a celebration of the entire cycle, not just individual moments.
Exactly. And it's a time when Buddhists worldwide visit temples, participate in ceremonies, meditate, and reflect on the Buddha's teachings.
That sounds beautiful.
Yeah.
But I've also noticed that some countries with large Buddhist populations struggle with poverty.
Yeah.
And if Buddhism is about achieving such a positive state of mind,
Right.
why is that the case?
That's a really thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
And it touches on this complex issue
Right.
of how we define and measure well-being.
Yeah.
While economic prosperity is important, Buddhism also emphasizes inner wealth, contentment, compassion, generosity, and a sense of purpose.
So it's about more than just material possessions.
Absolutely. Buddhism recognizes that true happiness comes from cultivating inner peace and living in harmony with oneself and the world around us.
Right.
And those qualities can exist even in the absence of material wealth.
So it's about finding richness in a different dimension.
Precisely. And while some Buddhist majority countries may face economic challenges,
Right.
it's important to consider other factors.
Yeah.
Strong family bonds, respect for elders, low crime rates, and a sense of community. These contribute to a sense of well-being that might not be reflected in purely economic measures.
Yeah. So it's about looking beyond the surface
Yeah.
and recognizing that well-being is multifaceted.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that some Buddhist majority countries, like Japan, are actually quite wealthy and economically advanced, demonstrating that Buddhism and material prosperity aren't mutually exclusive.
That's a good point. It challenges the assumption that Buddhism equals poverty. But I also haven't heard much about Buddhist charitable work.
Right.
Is that something they engage in?
Absolutely. Buddhist charity often flies under the radar because it's typically done quietly without seeking recognition or praise.
So it's more about action than publicity.
Exactly. The emphasis is on practicing generosity and compassion without ego or self-promotion. For example, Japanese Buddhist leader Nikkyo Nirwano won the Templeton Prize for promoting interfaith harmony, and many Thai monks have received awards for their social work.
Oh, wow. That's inspiring.
Yeah,
Are there other examples of Buddhist charitable work?
of course.
Yeah.
The Western Buddhist order, for instance, has been actively involved in helping lift people out of poverty in India.
Wow.
They've built schools, dispensaries, and even industries to provide education, healthcare, and economic opportunities.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
It shows how Buddhist principles can be translated into real-world action
yeah,
to alleviate suffering.
yeah.
But something I've always wondered is...